Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to talk about knights. We're going to talk about how they move. We're going to talk about how to use them most effectively in your games. We're going to talk about some things knights are good at, some things knights are bad at. This video is aimed towards more beginning intermediate level players. Obviously, expert players probably know a lot of these things, but I think there could be some things in here even for more seasoned players that some tidbits in here that you might not know. So you should definitely stick around regardless. Hopefully learn some things. So let's just start with the basics of knights. So how do the knights move? They move in L-shaped patterns across the board. So I'm going to highlight all of the squares that this knight here in the center of the board can jump to. 8 squares here. Now another way of looking at this, if you so choose, is knights can move 3 spaces. Knights move 3 spaces, but they can't move in a straight line. So for example, let's say you go 1 to the right and 2 down. That's one way. Let's say 2 to the right, 1 up. Let's say 1 left, 1 up, 1 left again. So that's the basics of how they move. Another key component of knights is that they are the only pieces in the game that can jump over other pieces and attack positions on the board. So for all intents and purposes, what this really comes down to is, just as a quick example here, not a good move, but if white chooses to capture this pawn and deliver check. When a knight checks a king, this check can never be blocked. It's the only piece in chess that you can do this with. So obviously here the king either has to move or the knight has to be captured, always. In this position, it would be better to capture the knight. But knight checks cannot be blocked, okay? So if we take a look at a bishop, for example, when a bishop delivers check on a king, this check can be blocked with the pawn. It can be blocked with a knight. It can be blocked with the bishop. If you really want, it can be blocked with the queen. So bishops, every other piece can be blocked. Knights cannot because they can jump over stuff. And that's an important piece of information on the knight, okay? More basics. Knight is worth 3 points of material. In terms of material calculations in chess, pawns are worth 1 point. Bishops are worth 3 points as well. That's why these are both called minor pieces. They're technically equal. Rooks are worth 5 points, and queens are worth 9 points. So bishops and knights, both minor pieces, both worth 3 points in the game. There's like a rivalry between these two pieces. Many people debate whether or not which piece is better. If you ask a lot of really experienced players, they're probably going to say that generally speaking, bishops are a little bit better than knights, because let's take this as an example here. This bishop controls all of these squares here on the board, in this open board, which, if my math is correct, this is 13 squares. I already mentioned that the knight only controls 8 squares. Bishops are more long-range pieces. They control more squares than knights in open positions. And that's why typically in endgames, bishops are better, because there's less stuff on the boards to block bishops. Knights don't care so much about that because knights can jump over things. Okay? But to really answer the question of which piece is better, you really have to look at the particular position. Bishop's better in open positions. Now we're going to look at a position here in front of us, which was a real Grandmaster game, which is what is known as a closed position, because all these pawns are staring at each other here, and this position is locked up. There's not a lot of opportunities to open up the board. And in this position, these pieces of material is all equal. White has a knight, black has a bishop. The other main difference here also is that white has a passed pawn, because both these pawns have already lost their opportunity to capture this. So this pawn, given the opportunity, can march up the board, which is important. But the main difference is the bishop and the knight. Equal material, but white is up. White is winning this game, clearly. And it's because of this knight to bishop issue that black has to deal with. So if you notice this bishop, this is a dark squared bishop. All of black's pawns here basically are on dark squares. So this bishop is just staring at its own pawns, and it's not really doing much. It's basically acting as a pawn, almost, just defending the pawns near it. And no matter where this bishop goes, all it's going to be doing is just looking at its own pawns. And this bishop, if the game remains in a close position like this bishop really doesn't have a lot of prospects. It's waiting for the board to open up. And if it doesn't, the bishop isn't accomplishing much. Now let's take a look at what the knight can do here. There's a couple of different strategies, but the main one is bringing your knight to f5, because your knight can maneuver around these closed positions to get where it needs to go. And here, let's just see it. Obviously, we can see it's attacking these two pieces. It's also supporting this pawn potentially moving up a square, which is another important, piece of information here. In this position, you would not actually want to trade your knight for the bishop, because as I just mentioned, the knight is actually better in these types of positions. Okay. Another thing that the knight could do is go to d3, and you can see here on d3 it's attacking also two pawns in your opponent's territory, which is something that the bishop simply can't do. So this is a quick rundown of why in certain situations knights are better than bishops. So it really depends on the position you're in, the game that you're playing, which piece is more valuable. Quickly, an example of a bad move here for white is f4. And that's because this allows black to open up the position. Even if this rook wasn't here on a1, you're allowing way more freedom for black's bishop, okay? You're giving him more squares to move to. So in this position with the knight, you want to keep the position closed. If you're the player with the bishop, you want to open it up, okay? That's the major difference here. Okay, we're going to go back to the main board. Another basic piece of information. As I've shown already, knights in the center of the board control 8 squares. One major piece of information about knights, they're much better in the center of the board. Many pieces are, but especially knights. So this knight controls 8 squares in the center of the board. That means it has 8 different moves it can make in the center. Let's move this knight to the side. This knight now only has 4 squares. So you've cut this knight's effectiveness and flexibility in half by putting it on the side of the board. And one more thing, we're going to put it all the way in the corner here on h1. How many places can this knight go now? 2 places. So this knight has 2 moves. Not good at all. General rule is always try to keep your knights in the center of the board. There are always exceptions to every rule, but this is a general rule, and for good reason. And an example of this is not only do you control less squares when you're on the sides of the board, but you have less places to move, which I mentioned, which really ultimately results in having a much easier time getting your knight trapped if you put your knight on the side of the board. So I have a really quick example here. And I made this up, but it's a realistic looking game. Okay? So we've made some moves here, developing moves. Black decides that they want to get rid of this bishop. They want to attack this bishop. Because white played a3, this bishop can simply retreat backwards. And let's say white plays c4, and you say, hey, you know what? I want to play d5. I want to open up the center of the board, but I can't because of these 2 pawns here. So I'm going to play c6 because I need to support my pawn push. Well, unfortunately, you've just lost your knight because this knight only has 4 places to go. And by playing c6, you've cut off this extra square here. The knight already couldn't go to b7. Now this knight can't go to c6 either because it's occupied. Now, all white has to do is play b4, and your knight's trapped. Your knight's under attack. Your knight can't move here. Your knight can't move here. It'll capture a pawn, but it'll be lost, and it already can't move to these 2 places. And this could seem kind of, academic or whatever, but this happens way more often than I think people realize, or this opportunity, for example, for white, arises more than you might realize when your opponents put your knights on the side of the board. So knights on the side of the board, no good. Keep your knights towards the middle, okay? Okay, so this is an example of trickiness of knights, because we're going to talk about a couple things knights are good at. And one thing that knights are good at is being tricky, is forking pieces, is confusing opponents, especially when your opponents don't have a lot of time to think. So this is an example of a game I played recently. I had white here, and it was my turn to move. Where do we want to put the knight? We want to put the knight on b5, because it's attacking two undefended pawns. So your opponent has to give up one of these pawns. And it's a great moment here to pause and think. I'm going to flip, if I can, flip this board. We're going to pretend to be black for 1 second. Which pawn do you want to give up here? What move do you make as black? And this kind of goes into a little bit of what we were just talking about. Okay? Think about it, and I will show you in a second. Okay. So if you said playing c6, that's the correct answer. You want to give up the a7 pawn because we're forcing this knight, even though we're losing a pawn, we're putting this knight in the corner of the board. And in fact, after knight a7, this knight, for the time being, is actually trapped because this square is covered, this square is covered, and this square is also covered. So, not that this is a bad move, but the knight is trapped here. So, unfortunately, my opponent played a6. I grabbed the pawn on c7. My opponent played a move, and then I played knight to e6. And this is kind of hard to calculate in real time when you don't have a lot of time on the clock and you're scrambling. Like, what is going on here? The knight's attacking this rook. Like, what do I do? This rook is under attack. These rooks are looking at each other. My opponent chose to try to trade rooks here. He took my rook. Unfortunately, this set up a beautiful knight fork. And my opponent resigned here because I ended up winning. When this is all said and done, I'm going to be up an entire rook and a knight. So just from a couple moves, this knight just waltzes across the board and just confuses the opponent. And this is what knights can do. Knights are just known at all levels of play for being tricky, okay? And if you can keep knights on the board late in the game, you can always have the opportunity to win because of these tricky positions and knight forks and things like that, okay? Another thing that knights are good at. Knights are good at stopping progress of enemies' passed pawns, of your opponent's passed pawns. So this pawn wants to march across the board. It's got two defenders backing it up. But if we want to stop this pawn, which we should, we can. A really good strategy is to just plant a knight in front of this pawn here, impeding the progress of the pawn. And the reason this is so good is because knights don't care about being in front of these pawns. Knights jump over stuff. This knight still has full range of motion here. This knight can still capture the bishop if it wants. It can still jump to f5 and attack the queen if it wants. So this is just generally a good idea for a good strategy for players is to put knights, to a lesser extent bishops, also in front of your opponent's pawns when they're trying to be pushed. The one thing you don't want to do is you don't want to swap these and put the rook here because the rook is much better on an open file where it has more freedom. If you put the rook here, it's just staring at this pawn. It's not doing anything. It's just defending. And you might as well leave the defending to your minor pieces. Okay? That's the basics of this. So just remember that knights can always be used effectively behind opponent's pawns if you don't want them to move forward. Another key use for knights is defense of your king. And this is another very classic example of your opponent creating a battery here with the bishop and the queen, attacking the weak h7 pawn of your castle's king. Now you can notice that this knight here on f6, which is a very common place for a knight, is perfectly defending this attack. If this knight wasn't here, you could play g6 and kind of block this, but it's generally not a good idea to move the pawns in front of your castled king, especially when all these pieces are still on the board, especially the queens, okay? If you move this pawn, especially because your opponent still has a dark squared bishop here, like let's just make a couple moves here and whatever. This bishop can now use these weakened squares these holes that you left by pushing your pawn forward to threaten your king and threaten the pieces near your king. So this is what you don't want to do. It's always better to have a knight here defending, okay? There's a million examples of this, but I'm just giving you one simple one. Okay, and now we're going to talk about one thing in particular that knights are really bad at. And knights are really bad at moving across the board. They're slow. A knight, I'm going to go back to this position here. Let's say you needed to get your knight here. Your knight has to move 5 times or 4 times, let's just say 4 times, to get from one side of the board to the other. Whereas a bishop, obviously, can go there in one move. So this is obviously something that affects all phases of the game, but it's more acute and more noticeable in endgames. Because knights are not good at stopping passed pawns from promoting. They're not good at stopping pawn promotions. So this is just a quick example of, even with white to move, there's no way for white, not there, for white to stop this pawn promotion. So white can go here because the king's defending, but there's no way to actually stop this pawn from promoting. That it is because the knight's slow mobility. It's also because knights, when they're around your opponent's kings, they have a little bit of a harder time like maneuvering so that the king is not actually attacking it. Okay, so this is something that knights are not good at. Now, if I have, so I don't have this, but I don't need to. I think you guys can visualize this. If this was a bishop instead, I think you can see this bishop is always going to cover this important promotion square. So there's nothing that black can do to stop you as white from trading your bishop for that queen when the time comes. So if this was a bishop, it would be a draw. Because it's a knight, this is a loss for white because this is going to become a queen. Okay, bishops are better in the end games because they like open boards and they can move all the way across the board, and they can always stop these pawns from promoting. This is another quick example of a knight in the corner with 2 pawns here, and I think it's pretty obvious that this cannot work because this king can't defend both pawn promotions, and this knight just simply can't get there in time. But if we look at this with a bishop, this is actually a draw now, because no matter what, even if white just moves his bishop back and forth, this bishop is always guarding this promotion square. This king is preventing the white king from coming around, and this pawn can never promote. Now, let's say that black plays his pawn here. Well, we can just grab that because our king's defending, and this bishop is always guarding this entire diagonal, reinforcing the idea that bishops, they are better at stopping pawn promotions, and they're better when these boards are open. Okay, so it's a major difference between bishops and knights. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about is important, and it's called knight outposts. A knight outpost is when you can plant your knight somewhere important on the board, preferably, almost always, defended by a pawn, anchored by a pawn, and this knight is difficult to dislodge from its position. Okay, so in this game, which I played recently, I jumped my knight up to d5. This is a very good move because it's putting additional pressure on this knight. This knight can't move because it's pinned because of the queen here and the bishop. This is not a knight outpost. Why? Because white can just play c3 and kick our knight away. That is why it's not an outpost. Okay? If your opponent can just harass your knight with pawns, it's not an outpost. But my opponent played c4, surprisingly. Now I would consider this a knight outpost because there are no pawns on either side of this knight that can attack it. Now, this is a lower level of a knight outpost because not in this particular moment, but maybe later, the knights can trade itself. Let's say this knight is not in as good enough of a position as this knight is, so it would like to trade itself for this knight, which is in a very good position. And you can see that this knight is attacking a lot of key squares in our opponent's territory. The other thing to notice is that our opponent still has a dark squared bishop, which means that this dark squared bishop can trade itself, if it wants to, for our knight, which is on the dark square on this outpost. These two things mean that this is an outpost, but it can be dislodged if white chooses to. But now let's change a couple things. Okay? Let's get rid of this knight. And now let's trade these bishops away. Now this is a real knight outpost. This is the ultimate knight outpost because white can no longer ever trade equally to get rid of this knight. This knight will never move unless black wants it to, or white is willing to trade down material, because this bishop can never attack it. The only pieces that can attack it are these rooks and this queen. And that's not a good trade for white if it trades a rook for a knight. Okay, so this knight can now no longer be ever moved from this position. And these are very important things to know when you're playing chess, because this knight is just invaluable in the game, where it's first of all attacking an undefended pawn here with check. It's attacking the bishop here. It could potentially fork these two pieces. This is just very, very useful in this position. The other thing to know, one more thing about knight outposts, is that your opponent can instead try to attack the defender. If he can dislodge the pawn that's anchoring your knight, then maybe he can capture the knight with the rook. Okay, so it's important to try to defend this position, this pawn, well. And I'm just going to go over one other knight outpost here from another recent game. It highlights that, and it highlights the power of the knight outposts. Okay, so here we were equal material. I had 2 minor pieces. My opponent had an extra rook. I sacrificed a pawn to get this knight outpost here, because again, this is the ultimate knight outpost. There's no way for black to ever dislodge this knight besides trading its rook. Okay, now once I get my rook to b7, I am double attacking this pawn here because of the knight. Let's see what my opponent does. He defends it, and so you see now my opponent is trying to undermine my defense of my knight. But all I need to do here is play f4. And after we trade, I still have a pawn here anchoring it. So it's important to keep this in mind when you have a knight outpost. Now let's see how I was able to use this knight to my advantage to win the game. Now this knight, again, controls a lot of key squares in our opponent's territory. I'm going to pause the video, or I'm going to let you guys pause the video and think about how to close this game out. There's a tactic here that is a little bit unintuitive, but you might be able to find with a little bit of time. So if you want, pause the video, find the killer blow here for white. I'll give you guys a couple seconds. Okay, so the move is actually bishop to g4 because of this knight outpost and the rook. So this looks like you're just dropping a bishop. Well, what happens if your opponent takes the bishop? Well, guess what? Your opponent's going to be checkmated, because this knight is guarding this very important square here, f7, that your king could use it as an escape. So we check, and we block, and this is checkmate. My opponent noticed that, so he actually didn't take the bishop. He went back, but I grabbed the pawn on e6 with check. My opponent moved, and I took another pawn. So I took 2 pawns here. Not only that, this rook was also trapped. This rook can't go here. This rook can't go here. This rook can't go here because of my knight. My opponent resigned. The only move was really to take the knight, but now I'm up 3 points of material, and I have this pawn that's just dominating. So that is it for this video. This, I think, is a good cherry on top that kind of shows the power of the knight outpost. And I hope you guys learned some things about knights. You know what? There is one more thing I want to show you guys, actually, because I forgot to mention it earlier. A little trick that a lot of people don't know. Knights, if this knight's on a dark square, it can only move to light squares. So every time you move a knight, it changes color. Okay? And that seems kind of useless information, but it might not be useless. It's not necessarily useless. Let's say we have a king here. Let's say we're black. Okay? Now, our opponent checks us. We want to avoid knight forks and knight checks, right? When we have not a lot of time with black. Okay. Our opponent checks. Okay? If you don't have a lot of time and you can't calculate every possible move, remember this. If your king is in check from your opponent's knight, if you simply stay on the same color, there's no way that this knight can check you again on the next turn. Because you move here, this knight has to move to a light square, which means that he can only be attacking dark squares. Okay? So I think that's a pretty useful little tidbit of information. When you're checked by a knight and you don't have time to calculate, just keep your king on the same color that it already was. Well, you can't go here, but keep it on the same color, and this knight cannot check you on the next turn. Okay? And that's because of that phenomenon that the knight changes color every time it moves. Okay? So a little useful piece of information. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, learned some things. Let me know in the comments below if you think I missed anything, and I'll see you next time.